Okay, so last week we talked about the idea of memorialization. We talked about various days on the year. We talked about Abraham and remembering Sarah. We talked about monuments, the idea of Yad Vashem we spoke about a little bit, and we also talked about this idea that came out of the Mishnah in Ta'anit, where there are certain days of the year which get memorialized specifically for loss. Now, this is a very important jumping off point to talk about now because there is a notion in Jewish thought that maybe once you have these days of Yom Kippur, of Tisha B'Av and the 17th of Tammuz, then there's really not anywhere else to go. There's no more to add to this picture now that we have these days of memorialization. And this became a very, very important question around the time of 1948, 1949, etc. When you get to 1948, you have these very important and competing ideas in the state of Israel. One of those ideas is that we cannot let the fallen of the Shoah be forgotten. We absolutely must remember them. It would be an absolute atrocity for us not to do something permanent to remember them. But there was a real problem. And the problem is, what story do you want to tell? And one of the great problems of the Holocaust was that the Zionists were trying to tell an entirely new story. What story were the Zionists trying to tell? The Zionists were trying to say that the Jews had been in a passive state for a long time, that they had been sort of inactive. We had davened for a state, but political Zionism in particular meant that we had to be active towards the state. And so there are various thinkers, Berdichevsky, Yosef Chaim Brenner, who are very, very strong advocates of there's a new Jew in town, and they're a very new thing. And remembering Jews as victims, as helpless victims in particular, was a real, very challenging for them, and it did not go with the Zionist ideology. If you are a dedicated listener of Dan Sinor's Call Me Back podcast, he just had an interview with Mati Friedman. Mati Friedman is a historian, does a lot of interesting things, and he just wrote a book about Chana Senesh. And he talks about this idea that these Jews, Chana Senesh among them, who paratrooped in behind enemy lines and end up in Yugoslavia and then cross the border into Hungary, Nazi-occupied Hungary. They knew they weren't going to defeat the Nazis by sheer force of arms. Maybe there were some people who had fantasies that they would ignite the spark of Hungarian resistance, communist resistance. Maybe there were those who may have felt that they were going to, once the Allies won, they were going to help all the Jews make Aliyah. But what seems to be what Mati Friedman argues is that Chana Senesh was aware that she was a new kind of Jew telling a new kind of story, and that the most important part of her mission was, in fact, the story that needed to be told, and that we Jews are not going to sit passively. All of this is a bit of a hakdama, it's a little bit of an introduction
The subject here. Go ahead.
to the question of how Israel memorialized Yom HaShoah. So there's my mentor, Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter, has done a lot of work on this subject, and he went through like the Knesset committee hearings, and the original date that they wanted for Yom HaShoah was worse. They wanted to choose one particular day, and they wanted to choose a day where Jews were not passive, where Jews were not sheep to the slaughter, that Jews were active and took their fate into their own hands, and that was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising gave them a sense of pride and power, and so they wanted it to be the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Day. The only problem is that Warsaw Ghetto Uprising starts on Erev Pesach. So on Erev Pesach, that's when they're going to do this memorialization. But wait a minute, you can't have a day which has sort of a religious dimension to it, which is going to be on Erev Pesach. Not in a Jewish state. You have to recognize that there's already a holiday on that date, so they're not going to do the Yom HaShoah on that day. So they are looking for another date. Now, what is interesting is that one of the dates which is proposed is the 20th of Sivan. The 20th of Sivan has certain virtues about it. What are some of the virtues of the 20th of Sivan? Well, the 20th of Sivan was a date that was originally established as a fast day for Ashkenazic Jews, specifically for French Jews in the town of Blois. This is a city where there were 30 Jews who were locked in a home and then burnt to death inside the house because of the accusation of a blood libel. What is unique about this situation is this is one of those situations where there was a blood libel, but there was no body produced. Usually, when you want to accuse the Jews of having killed an innocent young man for their blood on Pesach, you need to produce a body. In this case, there's no body produced. The circumstances seem to be that there was a I guess some servant who was driving a wagon full of supplies, and he probably came across a Jew who was a tanner, and tanneries smell awful, and the hides that he was carrying smelled awful, and the horse reacted to that and bolted and threw the carriage off, and its contents were ruined, spilled into the river, whatever it was, and he then said, well, the horse saw the body that the Jews used to kill a Christian child and make their matzah. There also seems to be a bit of a interesting backstory that one of the Jews had an affair with the wife of one of the noblemen, or the nobleman who was in charge, and this was to a certain extent a vendetta. However, why ever, the mix of circumstances, 30 Jews die on that day. Now, the most important rabbi of the era, Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam, this is Rashi's grandson, and he's really the father of the Tosafist movement. The Tosafists are the rabbis who appear on the outside margin of the standard printing of the Talmud, a very important part of Ashkenazic Jewry. Most of our custom and interpretation of Talmud comes from the Tosafot, and Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam is really the sort of the tour de force of this group of rabbis. Rabbi Tam said that we should fast on the 20th of Sivan, and he uses a very interesting term. He says, just like the day Kiyom Shemet Bo Gedalia ben Achikam, just like the day when Gedalia died, and that this should be a fast day for all Israel. This is unique because, first of all, it says that out of thin air, to a certain extent, a new fast day is created. And this new fast day is one that this tragedy should be felt by all the Jews everywhere, and it should be observed by everyone, and it should be as significant as the day in which Gedaliah died. Now, the day in which Gedaliah died is a significant day because Gedaliah was the last ember of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish self-rule in the land of Israel until the return of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so it's a very sad day because we lose the temple, but we still have a little bit of sovereignty. And Gedaliah is the snuffing out of that sovereignty. And it is a civil war. It's a murder from Jew on Jew. So it's a horrible day. And he says this day is as bad as that. And so he establishes a fast day on the 20th of Sivan. The reason this is important is that you have a rabbi who interprets a tragedy as uniquely different in his day. He sees something that's just so bitter, so difficult, such a sea change, that he says we have to declare a fast day, and fast days are also days of mourning. And so it is a novel fast day. The reason this is interesting is because many of the ultra-Orthodox camp in Israel said, we don't recognize Yom HaShoah. We don't recognize this secular holiday. We are not allowed to create a new day of mourning, but rather it should be Tisha B'Av. It should be the 9th of Av, which is the day when all of these remembered. And they set up the 10th of Tevet as maybe the day where you remember the members of your family who passed away. Maybe you say Kaddish for members of the family. You don't know what day they died. But they essentially, the ultra-Orthodox community wanted to create a structure which fit into all of the old traditional ways, the pre-existing places. And if you look at the Tisha B'Av Machzor, if you look at the one that we use, and many of the ones that are printed today, you will find that there are several poems of lamentation that have a specific name. They're called keynote, and they're only really said on Tisha B'Av. They are a version, they're a genre, if you will, that was invented by David for Shaul and Yonatan. We saw that last week, that he writes a kinah for them. There's also one that is done for King Josiah by the prophet Yirmiyahu. That's an old form, sort of it's maybe we would think of it as eulogy, but maybe it's more poetic. And so there's at least two. The ones that we used are one that was written by Rabbi Schwab, who comes from the Breuer, the Frankfurt Jewish community, and another one is written by Rabbi Halberstam. Rabbi Halberstam was himself a survivor of the Shoah. I think he may have lost like 10 or 11 children, something, or 10 or 11 members of his immediate family. And it's a very, very, I heard an interesting story. Apparently there was a boy who after the Shoah, before the Shoah, he was a star in yeshiva, and after the Shoah, he couldn't even put on a kippah. And they brought him to Rabbi Halberstam, the Klosenberger Rebbe, and and I think the Klosenberger Rebbe came to him and says, "It hurts, doesn't it? It hurts a lot." He says, "I can see." He says, "I lost, 11 family members or whatever that number is," and he related to the boy emotionally, and he spoke of his sense of loss, and that was the most comforting thing for this boy, who then a week later, at least the way the story is told, he put on tefillin, he put on tzitzis, he put his kippah back on, and he was able to come back because somebody finally spoke to his heart instead of his head. But so our two keynotes come from two people who have a very close relationship to this event, and they're in that machzor. And in terms of North America, that is probably the most durable memorial of the Shoah that we have in terms of a ritual moment. Yes, we probably get more people to all the Yom HaShoah events, but that is the one place where you can be certain that in 50 years, after all the survivors and all the second generation pass away, the people, there's still going to be people saying those keynote on Tisha B'Av. Okay, Aaron, you have your hand up.
Yes, the religious section of Israel did not want to enact a new holiday because of the various sensibilities. But a huge proportion of the Israelis who came out of the Second War as either displaced people or the settlers who had come over the first and second aliyot had a very different point of view. They didn't care what day it was. So how do we reconcile their sensibilities to the way in which we have enacted the Yom HaShoah and the various days of mourning for the members who were lost?
I think the answer to that is there are three groups of people. There, the ultra-Orthodox who say, we've got our ways of remembering the Shoah. It happens on Tisha B'Av. It happens on the 10th of Tevet. That's what we do, and we're good. Thank you. Knesset does not get to vote a new holiday into existence. They don't even put on tefillin in the morning. They don't say Shema. They don't keep Shabbos. I don't have to listen to Knesset. Gamar, we're done. There's another group of people all the way on the other side who are basically saying, look, the rabbis don't define things for me, and it's very important for us as a state to remember the Shoah. And so we believe very strongly in the secular holiday. But you should recognize that this secular holiday borrows a lot from from um, from um, from I guess non-Jewish tradition, right? It was the governor of Cape Town or something who came up with the idea of at 11:11 either shooting off the cannons or having a moment of silence for all of those who did not return home from World War One, and then that was done for Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Remembrance Day, which is actually tonight, and then that moved from and so the air raid sirens that they had that they sound on Yom Ha on Yom HaZikaron are really an echo of Remembrance Day. And then they said, oh, that it's so meaningful on Remembrance Day, we should do that for the Shoah also. So it's sort of a secular evolution. Not that that's wrong. That doesn't have holiness. Things there's such thing as a minhag that can develop holiness, and so I think we should be aware of that and endorse that. But then there's a third group. The third group is probably the one where we would put our tent pole, and those are the ones who say, look, you know what, we sort of see both. That especially the students of Rav Kook had this perspective that the Rav Kook had this perspective that the the nation has a certain kedusha to itself, and that the Knesset is really sort of the will of God on some level, and so this has a certain amount of kedusha to it. And I would say that in the religious Zionist community, I think in general that is how it is understood. Now, going back a little bit to a slightly different, going back a little bit in my movement, I just want to point out this day, the 20th of Sivan, was also a memorial day for a different tragedy, the Khmelnytsky massacre. And so I think that there is room, certainly in Jewish tradition, to set up some of these new days of memorial. I think there is such a thing, and I think it's actually very important because I think these events have real consciousness, and I think it is also a little bit disingenuous to say all we've ever had is Tisha B'av, because there are many other pieces of memorial which have come into Jewish tradition, of which some of them are Yizkor. Yizkor came into Jewish tradition in the wake of a tragedy, as did some of the mourning practices of the Omer period, because the Crusades are the ones that happened during the time of the Omer. They happened leading up to Shavuot, and so this period of time was particularly bitter for Ashkenazic Jews because of what occurred in the year 1096 to the communities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And so we invent. I shouldn't say invent. We memorialize through new vehicles all the time. And part of that is a little bit related to inspiration. But let's in the 10 minutes I have left in this segment, I want to get to Kaddish, right? How does Kaddish come about? So Kaddish is generally attributed to a section of the it is I think it's the Midrash Eliyahu Zuta, the Tana Debei Eliyahu, and the story goes as follows. I will maybe the story goes. All right, I'm trying to decide whether to work off the Hebrew. What we're going to do? Okay. Amar Batenu. Okay, there was Rabbi Akiva once encountered a person who was naked and he was black like charcoal, and he carrying a whole bundle on his shoulder of thorns, and he was like, and he ran like a horse. And Rabbi Akiva says to him, Matua, why are you working so hard? Why is this so hard for you? And he wanted to unburden his load. And he says, if you're poor, right, I can make you rich. So this person says, don't stand in my way, because you may anger those who sit above me. So he says, Amrulo mamasecha. What is your profession? Amrulo oto aish. Ma metu. He says, I'm actually dead. V'chol yom v'yom sholchim oti lachtov etzim v'sorfan oti bahem. Every day they tell me I need to chop wood and then they burn me with them. Amru lo b'Reb Akiva b'ni ma'ita malachtecha ba'olam shebe'emet shabata mimenu. What was your profession in the world you came from? Amru lo gabay hamas. I was a tax collector, and I was amongst the heads of the people. And I would flatter the rich, and I would oppress the poor. And I transgressed many, many very serious sins. Did those who oppress you now, those who are above you now, did they tell you there's any way to fix yourself? Maybe they're going to give me more troubles. Don't bother me. Ki ein lo takana. There's no way to fix it. Ela shamati mehem davar she'enu yachol liot. I heard from them something that could not be true. Shi'omoli hayado lazeha ani ben shehu omed bakav omer baruch Hashem v'barach. If I have a son who says in the synagogue, Baruch et Hashem v'barach, blessed is God who is the one to be blessed, and people say after him, Baruch Hashem v'barach l'olam va'ed. So that's the exchange that we have before we read the Torah, right? Or before we say Ma'ariv. Oh, Yomru Kaddish, or perhaps they'll say Kaddish, V'onim Acharav Yeheshmei Rabbim Mevarach, and the congregation will say, may the name of God be blessed. Miyad Hayu Matirno Tomina Paronot. They would release him from his difficult servitude and his punishment. Ulam Hu Lo Hiniach Ben Ba'olam. But he says, I didn't leave a son after me. And Avazav et ishto mu'beret. He abandoned his wife when she was pregnant. I mean, this is quite a guy. Ve'eni yodea im yalda zachar mi yilamdu Torah. And I don't know if she had a son, who would teach this kid Torah? She'ein lo ahuv ba'olam. He's got nobody who loved him in the world. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva mashimcha. He says, what's your name? Amar lo Akiva. And he says, my name is Akiva. V'shem ishtecha. And what's your wife's name? Amar lo Shushniva. He asked him, get details, right? So Rabbi Akiva was very, very troubled by this, and he says, I'm going to go find this kid in order to teach him Torah and to have him stand in front of the congregation. So he goes, he looks for him, and he comes to this place, and he finally finds him. And he talks about his fathers, and he says, may his bones be ground to dust. Evil person. He talks to his wife. She says, may his memory be blotted out of this world. Sha'alat ben, he says to the son, Amru, Hare Arelhu. He was uncircumcised. Afilu mitzvot mila lo asku. They didn't even give him a brit milah. Miyad Rabbi Akiva malav. He brought him to a brit milah, right? And he brings him to Rabbi Akiva sits in fasting for 40 days so that he will start to learn Torah. And the heavenly voice comes out and says, Rabbi Akiva, go teach him Torah. Halach v'lamdo Torah v'kriyat Shema u'shmona esrei u'brachot. He goes and teaches him, kriyat Shema and shmona esrei, birkat hamazon, and he ultimately brings him in front of the congregation, and he says Baruch Hu, and the Kal says Baruch Hu, and he says Kaddish, and they say Yeheshmei Rabbah, and afterwards he teaches the Mishnah and Talmud, Halacha, Agadah, right, everything. Ad shetanuch until he becomes a great and wise person. And his name is Rabbi Nochum Hafakuli, right? And many great Torah scholars came for him. And at that very moment, this person who was chopping the wood and to build the fire that would burn him every night, he was released from this. And he comes to Rabbi Akiva in a dream. V'amar yihiratzon shetanuch datcha b'gan Eden. You should rest in Gan Eden. Kishem shehanachta et da'ati v'tzaltani miad midin Gehenna. Since you rescued me from Gehenna, from hell, you should get even better. And when my son went into Beit Knesset and he said Kaddish, they ripped up my horrible decree. And when he went to the Beit Midrash, they they ripped up all of the accusations against me. And when he became a great scholar and they called him rabbi, they put my kisei, my seat in Gan Eden next to the tzaddikim, the Hasidim. And they gave me several crowns, right? And all of this is from the zchut, the merit of that which you did for me. Okay, so it's more or less the story of Kaddish. I mean, it obviously has a couple of features which are rather difficult. If somebody abandoned his pregnant wife, I'm not sure I would give him a seat in Gan Eden. Maybe I would forgive him, but a seat in Gan Eden next to other remarkable people, maybe I wouldn't give him. But this is the important, I think, distillation of this is that and this is a scary thing living in the world we do. Your children after you have a strong spiritual impact. You'll note that Kaddish was not the only mitzvah here, right? Did people notice that?
It's something new. It is. I mean,
so it wasn't all about the Kaddish. Kaddish was maybe the releasing mitzvah. Maybe it was the one that released him from the fires of Gehenna. This is, by the way, why Ashkenazim do not say Kaddish for full 12 months. They only say 11. Because we don't want to believe that our parents are so evil they're going to be in Gehenna the whole time. They only get 11 months. And that's why also many people have a custom to study extra Torah for them. Right, when Reverend Marciano, when he had his shloshim, we did a siyum on Tanakh. We finished all of the chapters. Or no, we did all the parshiot of the Torah. So this gives you the basis of what Kaddish is all about. This gives us this idea about the idea that that the mitzvot that those who live after us. This is, by the way, I mean, a couple of years ago on Yom Kippur, I gave a sermon about hiring people for Kaddish and how it's not such a great idea. So somebody came up to me afterwards and he says, "Rabbi, you know what goes on around here, right?" And he was referring to the fact that they hire, I won't drop any names, but they hired people to say Kaddish for a relative, right? And I said, I know that happens, but when anybody ever asks me, I say to them, I would rather see you come once a week and say Kaddish for your own relative than to hire someone. And there have been a number of people who said, who have, whether business or medical schedules or whatever conflicting schedules make it hard for them to do every Kaddish for their parents. So I said to them, listen, if you can't do a Kaddish for a parent, so go study a Mishnah, and there's a text that you say afterwards if you want to dedicate it. And the reason I like that is because this story is really about the child who is making spiritual achievements that credit to the parent, and that's really the bottom line. And I think that can be true even without the blood connection, right? Because if you say to me, look, I had a teacher in the 5th grade who had no children, but he was an amazing teacher, and my love of Torah is for him. My love of giving charities for him. My love of helping other people is from her, right? I don't see why that doesn't work, right? That should all work in the same vein. So, okay, that's our sort of, we'll wrap up the basics on that one now. Gives us sort of various. Yes.
sorry, just before you end, why during COVID, when you started the morning Zoom for those of us who couldn't go to shul to say Kaddish?
Well, it's the same thing. It's like learning, right? Kaddish is only one of the mitzvot that are listed there, right? But afterwards, he even has learning as part of the credit system in the story, right? Because the young man, he becomes a real scholar, and when he becomes a real scholar, they ripped up all the decrees against him, and when he became a rabbi, he got a seat in Gan Eden. So that's why the story gives us license to use study of Torah almost as equivalent to Kaddish. They're just two examples of mitzvot. So that's why I felt we could use that.